All right, we're going to start again. This time, you didn't have to wait for the big reveal. Here it is. This is our third panel. This is my wellness, my resiliency look, okay? This is my island look, man. Come on. This is a panel about resiliency in the work, getting real about burnout, about sustainability and wellness. I'll facilitate this panel, and I'm going to now introduce our panelists, and I'll be more respectful in doing that. First of all, to my left, Dr. Liz Cheney. Dr. Cheney is a licensed clinical psychologist. She is the embedded counselor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where she specializes in the treatment of anxiety, depression, trauma, and identity-based concerns. Her work is grounded in social justice, liberation, and compassion. Dr. Cheney's inspiration to be a psychologist stems from her ancestors, specifically her grandmothers, who helped her to feel seen and heard through some of the most challenging times in her life. In her work, she aims to create a safe and supportive space where students can share their story and feel empowered to achieve their wellness goals. Prior to working at the GSB, Dr. Cheney was an embedded counselor right here at the law school. She worked exclusively with law students for nearly 2 years, and that's how we met, actually. She also runs a small private practice and has experience working in community mental health and mental health startup. Additionally, she's passionate about improving access to culturally responsive psychological care for diverse communities. Thank you for being here, Dr. Cheney. Next to Dr. Cheney is Claire Riva. Claire is a CDC alum. She graduated from SLS in 2018. She clerked in the District of Maryland and did nonprofit civil rights appellate work before moving to Seattle to be a public defender, where she's been for the last 3 years. And our third panelist, Veena Seelam. Veena graduated from SLS in 2016. She, too, is a criminal defense clinic alum, and she also participated in the Three Strikes Project and the Street Law Pro Bono here at Stanford. She interned at the Legal Aid Society Criminal Defense Division in New York City, at Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, and she also worked at the Alameda County Public Defender's Office as an intern. After graduating, Veena worked first as a post-bar legal assistant at the Alameda County Public Defender's Office, and then as an attorney there for 3 years. She then moved across the Pacific, and she may have earned the longest distance traveled. I'm not sure, it's either her or Abigail. Because she actually is coming to us from the Northern Mariana Islands. She moved across the Pacific to join the Public Defender's Office in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, where she worked for 3 years before she decided to try her hand at civil litigation at the Office of the Attorney General there this past year. Veena is already eager to return to the practice of public defense work. So these are our panelists for this panel on resiliency in the work, getting real about burnout, secondary trauma, and wellness. And so let's start with an agreement on terms, if we could, panelists. When I refer to burnout, I'm using Dr. Christina Maslach's classic definition: a prolonged response to chronic emotional and interpersonal stressors, a response that's characterized by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. That's what I mean when I say burnout. When I refer to secondary trauma, I'm describing the damage that's caused by a lawyer's exposure to a client's primary trauma. Exposure to client after client in trauma translates into more and more secondary trauma for a lawyer. A mountain of unaddressed secondary trauma can lead to burnout. So my first question for you, Claire, and you, Veena, is if you reflect on your years in practice, when you think about burnout and secondary trauma, how have those issues emerged for you? And I guess specifically, have you had experiences that revoked? Have you had experiences that evoked those kinds of responses? Have you noticed how those types of experience might have played out for others that you've met in your practice?
Sure. Is this working?
I think so. Did you click the on?
It's on.
All right.
It's on. Yes? Okay. Yeah, I mean, so after 3 years at the Alameda County Public Defender's Office, mostly based in Oakland, I fled to an island across the Pacific. So I think I was experiencing what I would describe as burnout. And I think there were a lot of factors that contributed to that, but a few that stick out for me is one is that, of course, there's a sheer volume of cases that you're dealing with, and you kind of start to lose the personal connection to your clients, which there is a lot of emphasis on in clinic. And we were blessed with the opportunity, at least in my clinic year, we had 3 clients for the whole quarter, right? Whereas when you go into misdemeanor practice in a county in the Bay Area, we're still lucky here compared to a lot of other places in the country, but it's not unusual to be doing a calendar assignment even where you're dealing with 50 people in a day, or 10 new intake cases of people who are in jail and arrested, that morning. And so I think it's hard when you're dealing with just that number of people who are all trying to share their experiences with you. It's natural for that depersonalization to occur, and you lose a bit of the connection and what motivates you to do the work. I think another thing for me was it started to feel like it was really hard to feel like there was a positive outcome a lot of times. Maybe you would have a win, you would get a case or even several cases dismissed, or you would even win a trial, but then the very next thing you have to do is address this other mountain of cases that probably weren't going to lead to wins. And then oftentimes how you define a win, right, would be if an offer on a case was originally 1 year for the client to spend in jail and you managed to get it down, even let's say significantly, you get it down to 10 days, sure, that's theoretically a win, but it still involves a lot of trauma for the client and having the experience that they've already had to go through, and even 10 days in jail is a significant amount of time. So I think it just starts to, at a certain point, feel like there's not a lot of positive outcome depending on how you define it, which I think I'm really happy that the earlier sessions were more on the movement lawyering and impact litigation, because I think that's one of the keys to maybe balancing out or rethinking, redefining what sort of outcome you should be looking for, you should be expecting as a public defender. Start with that.
Thank you. Claire?
Yeah, I think that's all right. I think the unfortunate reality is that if you're going to be a public defender, you are going to deal with burnout and secondary trauma. And one thing that I think we in this room are all really well equipped with is coming from clinic or knowing Professor Tyler, and for me it was Professor Louvain, but also Carly, who is wonderful, is understanding from the beginning that building in your own kind of wellness practices and sustainability from the beginning makes such a big difference to your sustainability in the long term, I think. And I felt very lucky in knowing that from the beginning, because I started experiencing burnout probably after my first 2 years when I was doing misdemeanor practice and just had a huge volume. And then I moved into a slightly lower volume, but still too high volume felony practice. And I could tell that I was burnt out. And recovery is like a long process, right? It's really kind of day by day, goes in waves, and it can take many months, I think, when you're still doing the job. So learning the signs and how you personally are going to be able to mitigate their effects on your work, I think is important. I know that for me, unfortunately, I think when I find myself not wanting to do the hard things is when you know that it's affecting your clients, right? So much of our job is making your clients feel seen and heard, and trying to explain their experiences to other people in the system is so often, at the end of the day, what our role is, no matter what the context is. And, I remember once figuring this out. I did this really big meeting with this very young client who was charged with, he was in kind of a difficult situation factually, because he was charged with what we call an on-view no contact order violation, which is when the police saw somebody too close to somebody that they're not supposed to be in contact with, and so it can be very easy for the state to prove, even if the other person doesn't want to participate, because they like hand these contact orders out like candy to anyone, even when the protected party doesn't want them. And it can be a very difficult legal situation for people because it increases their exposure very quickly. And there was this young man, and I remember he came in, and it's funny because it was probably like the least lawyerly client meeting I had ever had at that point. But we just talked for like hours about his life growing up and his challenges and these things that I hadn't known earlier in my representation of him. And I was like, this is just so unfair for this person. And you really feel that, and like so much of our job is really empathizing that. And so I wrote this big thing for the prosecutor, basically being like, and it felt weird at the time because you don't like to acknowledge that they have a strong case, but being like, even though this happened, here are all these reasons why it's not fair for this person to be in this situation. And that prosecutor ended up sending me an email a few days later being like, the protected party doesn't want to participate, so we're going to dismiss this case. And that was so great because that they didn't need that person to participate. He was understanding why it was inappropriate to move forward with that case, and that felt like such a big win and such a valuable reflection, I thought, on really kind of empathizing and putting yourself in your client's shoes and like being there with them. That kind of practice also can cause a lot of secondary trauma buildup and burnout. And I recently was in a similar situation with a client who was similarly, in a difficult legal position. And I found myself really not wanting to do that exercise, or not necessarily not wanting to do it. I wanted to do it with him, but every day that it came down is like today, the day that I'm going to go have this really hard conversation. And for like a month, the answer was no, right? And eventually we did it, and I did the exact same thing, and then the prosecutor got back to us and didn't agree with our position, and this person is still in a very difficult situation. And that's kind of like the opposite side of the spectrum. And so I think that seeing when, like, learning to recognize, oh, I'm avoiding doing this thing, that's going to be hard and risky, sign of burnout. And trusting yourself to take steps to recover and to set your own boundaries. I don't want to just like talk ad nauseum, but you did have a couple other questions, which how you see sometimes these things manifesting, if I can. So I think that one of the ways that I think can lead to burnout, that is one of the biggest pitfalls that I see some of my colleagues making, and I try to avoid myself, is when people don't trust their clients in their own decision making, because there's already so much stress in the job, and some people will think, our job at the end of the day is to, as best as we can, do what our clients want. And there are people who will really second guess what their clients are doing and will be like, I don't think you should be making X decision. And I think that is an example of people taking on stress that at the end of the day, not only is it not your job, but in my opinion, it's not good to be trying to convince your client to be doing something they don't want to do. You give them your opinion and your advice, and you let them make the decision. And so I think that really learning and really understanding that your job is trusting your client to know their own life better than you do, right, is a really important way to mitigate the kinds of additional stresses that could lead you into that situation. I also think that over personalizing or not trusting yourself as an attorney, way easier said than done. But we had that panel earlier, and Karina was talking about when she took everybody into the hallway and talked to them about their outcomes. To stand in front of a whole room full of clients, much less one person, and be like, it is a little risky, but if you want to go to trial, I think you have a good case for X, Y, and Z reasons. That takes a lot of confidence, and I think that if you are not, confident that you can be as good of a lawyer as you can be in a resource-constrained system, right? Then you're also going to be constantly thinking maybe something doesn't go your way, and you're like, oh, it's my fault. And at the end of the day, the system is set up so that we don't win. We're not supposed to be able to do everything that we want to do. And thinking that that's your personal failing rather than a system failing, I think can also lead to a lot of burnout.
You touched on an answer, and I'm going to loop in Dr. Cheney soon, but you touched on an answer to the question of how you have seen other folks, how you've seen these issues rise in other folks' practices. And I wanted to invite Veena. I don't know if you had any reflection in that regard.
Yeah, as Claire was talking, I was thinking about, I think another, like, how do you know that somebody is experiencing burnout? I think when you start to hear people and yourself thinking in a way that feels like there's no correlation between what you do and how much work you put into a case and any different result coming from it. So you kind of stop seeing yourself, stop viewing yourself as an efficient person or somebody who's really contributing anything. And I think it's both a symptom and a sign, right? It's when you have enough experiences where you kind of see the randomness of justice being meted out, right? And it's just like, which judge did this case happen to be assigned to, which prosecutor was sitting in the courtroom that day, that ends up being so much more influential in a lot of ways on the outcome for the client than anything that you actually do. And I think when you see that over and over, you start to just question, does anything that I do matter? And that makes, I think it's easy to fall into a trap of trying less and then kind of doing the minimum because you feel like even if you work as hard as you possibly can, you stay late, you don't sleep, you meet the client for hours and hours and really get to know them, and then the same bad outcome can happen. It kind of disincentivizes you from keeping trying. So I would say I see that, I've seen that happening with other people, certainly, where you start off really gung-ho thinking that there's some kind of positive correlation between how much work you do and the outcome for the client, and then you pretty quickly realize that it's all over the place. That relationship is not a straight line. So if you stop believing in your ability to change things and then you stop trying, and I think that's how a lot of people miss opportunities to do the impact lawyering within the public defender context. I think a lot of people probably feel, what's the point of even trying a writ, because it's not gonna make a difference. When you start to feel like that, to me, that's a sign of burnout.
Yeah. So in clinic, in our self-care sessions, we focused on success stories. So I'm really interested in the ways in which the two of you, and this will be also shortly a pathway for Dr. Cheney, the ways in which the two of you have been able to utilize practices that have made a difference for you in maintaining a sense of wellness and developing resiliency skills. What are some of those practices? Maybe, Veena, you can start out this time.
Sure. Well, for me, I kind of went back to just what makes me feel happy generally outside of work and trying to maximize those things. So being outside, sunlight, exercise, connection with other people that aren't, not necessarily my colleagues. I think that the connection with colleagues is also important, and being able to debrief and discuss what's going on is hugely important and therapeutic, but also having some people outside of your life who have no idea what you do at work and what issues you're facing, I think is also helpful. But it's easier said than done, right? I think it's really hard, especially when you're starting out and you might feel like you have a lot to prove. You don't want to be the person that's leaving at 5 o'clock because you have to go on a run, or right? It makes it seem like maybe you're not as committed as other people, but I think, to have the courage to do that, to really know yourself and how you're feeling and how you're going to be a better advocate for your clients in the end. And if it means you have to take an hour-long lunch break to go for a long walk or go to the gym or whatever it is, I think it's really important to listen to that and act on that.
Thank you. Claire?
Yeah, I think that's so important to have other things in your life and then to feel comfortable setting boundaries. I mean, you could work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and still have more that you would want to be able to do for your clients. So at a certain point, you do have to, you will have to set boundaries and leave the work at a time when there is more to do, because there's always going to be more to do. And then having something that can refresh you in that time. I mean, one thing that I personally do and try and convince my colleagues to do a lot is, to your point, if you have downtime at work, like maybe there's an afternoon where you don't have anything urgent for the next hour and it's sunny in December in Seattle, I will go for a run and get outside and get some sun. And, you know, because I know that there will be other times where I won't be able to do that, where I will work late. You know, I try to forgive myself if there's some time during the workday where I can do something for myself and feel like I need to just do that, because I know that there's other times where you won't have, you know, you're always going to make up for it. It's kind of an interesting setup, because being a public defender, we talked about this a little bit, you're more in control of your own work schedule to some extent. I mean, obviously the courts are very much a part of that, but if you don't have court, you're doing your own caseload management and making sure that you're on top of what you need to be on top of. So I think that people tend to sometimes feel like they need to be, you know, at their desk 8 to 5 or 6 every day so people can see that they're there. But really the nature of the work is so much more all over the place than that, that I think that we also need to apply that sometimes to fulfilling your own needs, even if it's at like 3 p.m. on a Wednesday.
Thank you. So Dr. Cheney, we've sat here and listened to Claire and Vina talk about their experiences, their struggles, the experiences and struggles of their colleagues, and we've also heard some of their solutions. I'm curious, if you had, let's say, you're embedded at the business school, if you'd been embedded in one of their offices and they'd come to you describing these things, I'm just curious about how you might have responded, and I'm also curious what your thoughts are on the techniques that they have used.
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay? So first and foremost, I really want to validate and normalize the experiences that you all are having, and just, this isn't me counseling you, but just me thinking about being a mental health practitioner and all the parallels between our work and being in a caregiving profession, and you know how challenging it is to have a job where you're sitting with other people's pain, and what you do with that and how you work through that. But I think a couple questions that I would ask you all is, you know, what training or experience do you have in knowing how to support yourself emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually? And how connected are you to your internal experience? And then for follow-up, I think, you know, what are you doing at the end of the day / end of the week to help release some of what you've seen, and to really think about, you know, to maintain your humanity after all the things that you're seeing. And I think so often for people, the answer to both is no. Like, no, I'm not doing anything, no practices, and also I don't have any training or experience on connecting with my internal experience. And that's actually okay, because you know you can always start now. But I would really suggest that. And a question that I often ask my clients is, what is your relationship to your emotions? And I give the analogy often of a beach, and the idea of, are you getting pummeled by the waves? Like, are you a person who's being flooded by your emotions? Are you off on the sand to where you can't even see the water? But ideally, you want to be a person who's actually surfing the waves and in control of your own emotions and really aware of what's happening. And so often clients tell me they're way off on the sand, or they know what their emotions are, but they don't really get connected to them. So that's one thing I would start with. And then another thing I think to keep in mind is kind of the context of why you're doing this work. I think often with helping professions that people can be drawn to the work because of experiences they've had in their own lives. And not to pathologize anyone's reasons for getting into the work, but sometimes our clients' experiences, they can resonate with us. And noticing when we're getting a little over-identified and realizing that, oh, I need to maintain realistic boundaries and realistic expectations of myself, you know? But just a few things that I've seen that really work for myself, that work for my clients, and work for my community are, one, having a sense of love, support, and community in your life, people who you really feel like care about you and that you care about, and being able to, people that you can talk to at any time of the day and who are really gonna be there for you. And then I think also rest and fun, which it sounds like that's so simple, but truly resting, I think back on myself, last Friday, I had to check in with myself. I realized that I was exhausted, and I noticed that my curiosity had gone out the window, which I think is one of the first things that happens to me when I feel burnt out. And I started thinking, I can't wait to get this over with, which really, that's not like me. I'm a really curious person and really passionate about my work, but I realized that wasn't about my client, that was about me, you know? And so checking in with yourself around that. And then I think also having a routine of self-care, and I preach this to my clients a lot, but a lot of people try to spot care, I think, self-care, where they just try and like meditate when they're panicking or something. And it's like, no, you have to have a routine and you have to know what works for you. And I think like for me, you know, if I don't go on a long walk, like I get a little cranky sometimes, you know, like I just knowing the things that this is what works for me and this is what I do consistently. And then I think a couple of other things is if you think about like in concentric circles, I realize this is a really long answer, but I have a lot that I want to say. I'm really passionate about it.
It's not too long at all.
I think about like there's your typical burnout in circle one, and then the second circle is secondary trauma, which of course you're gonna have with the things that you're seeing if you're an empathetic person. But then the third circle, I think, is what I'm actually being triggered by in the room with my clients, and being able to check in with yourself and know your internal experience and know like, okay, like this is actually about something else, and that happens to me in my work, and I make a note of like, oh, this is work for my therapist, like perfect. And so I think with secondary trauma, it's so important that we address that, you know, with a therapist.
Thank you. That is all wonderful and thought-provoking, and leads to my next question. So, as you all know, one of the wellness practices that I promote is mindfulness meditation. And Dr. Cheney, you certainly have experience in this area. You just actually made mention to meditation, but I also know that when you were here at the law school, you co-led a meditation series with Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Tyrion Steinbeck. I think it was called Meditation for Liberation, which is great. So I want to ask you, why is a mindfulness meditation practice useful to enhance wellness?
Yeah, I remember that series very fondly, and I remember you coming in. It was wonderful and teaching a class. But I came into meditation because it was my second year in grad school, and it was my first time doing full-time clinical work. And I was doing community mental health work, and I was starting to have all kinds of physical symptoms. And I went and talked to my primary care doctor, and she said, I think you're stressed. And she said that, you know, we have a mindfulness-based stress reduction course here at Kaiser. Would you like to sign up? And that class actually changed my life. Like, it helped me to develop a practice, and I practiced consistently daily for like the next few years. And I think the three biggest things are, one, it helps to regulate your nervous system. It helps you to get out of fight or flight and reduce the production of cortisol and increase the happy neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine. But then also I think it helps you to enhance your self-awareness, and it helps you to actually slow down and sit with yourself. I think so many of us don't take the time to actually slow down and notice what we're doing and notice our emotions. And then I think also it helps you to reduce self-judgment. You know, I think that as humans, we can never be fully judgment-free, but I think even getting into the practice of reducing that judgment towards ourselves and towards our clients makes us better humans and also better in our work. And just one more thing about meditation. My favorite thing about it is that once you learn it, you don't need anything outside of yourself to practice, and it's accessible to anyone.
So, Claire and Vina, is that a practice that you pursue at all? And I guess this time we'll start with you, Claire.
I do dabble. I learned it here at Stanford, and I remember both in clinic, and there was also a seminar that you can take here, or that you could when I was here, and I just remember it was hard for me the practice of letting your thoughts go, but I find myself actually doing it more, trying to harness that kind of a practice more and more now, because so much of the way I think that the stresses of the job can affect you and the volume of the work can affect you is to have these kind of running thoughts that you can't let go of. So even if you're not at work, you're thinking about work, you're thinking about your clients, you're preparing some closing argument in your head, or you're all of a sudden you're like, oh, I could try and get this piece of evidence or that piece of evidence. And stopping those things is, at least, you have to fall asleep or to be present with your family or things like that. So I'm trying actually to do it more now, because I think that's the practice of being able to let your thoughts kind of pass by you non-judgmentally is one of, because you're going to have them, right? Probably, especially in any line of work, but often in this one too.
For me, I think I find mindfulness time in other activities a lot of times. So I have not been able to master the art of, sitting and just coming into a mindful state. But, rowing on the ocean, which is something that I can do where I currently live, is, for me, puts me into a state that I think is one that separates me from, whatever happened previously, and just kind of to regenerate during that time. So I think for me, it's been more about physical practices, and also, again, being out in nature, like even just soaking in the sun. So sometimes I'll just leave my office and go stand outside, which sounds very simple, but I do think that it has some benefit, both just separating yourself mentally from the space that you were in. In our work, we're not forced to be in certain spaces in the way that our clients are, but a lot of the time we are in very ugly spaces, right? Ugly for a lot of reasons. And I think that can take a toll on you when you're in jails and courts that are not necessarily, beautiful, well lit, happy places. And so for me, making sure that I am in spaces that feel very different from that, and that I can kind of reset in, is important, and I think leads to some mindfulness activities. I'm probably guilty of the sort of spot checking too. So I've used the breathing techniques that we practiced in clinics. I do use that when, on occasion, if I can't escape for longer, right? And I'm sitting in my office or in court. I've done that in courthouse bathrooms more times than I can count. So that was a very useful thing to learn, definitely.
So what Veena is, I can't resist, but what Veena is referring to, I believe, is square breathing, which is a wonderful practice of, some people call it block breathing or 4x4 breathing, where you breathe in for 4, then you hold for 4, you breathe out for 4, and then you hold for 4. You do like 3 or 4 cycles of that, and it's remarkable how just that practice can help you become centered and ready for that next thing that you're about to do that was maybe triggering you. I also was responding as you were talking, Veena, to what you said about being in ugly spaces, and something that others have said that really resonates with me is that, I think about how many years I've spent in confinement, in jails and in prisons, just because of the time spent visiting people who actually didn't have the privilege of leaving, but how even for me, the impact that has had on me, and the ways in which we are treated often by the jailers who see us in the same way as our clients. It's a privilege to be seen, frankly, the same way as my client, but it's also, it has impact. And then the last thing that you said that definitely resonated for me is the simple act of getting up and going outside. It's a wonderful reminder, and I have to keep reminding myself of that. It's like, stop what you're doing, Ron, get up and walk outside. It's right there. So thank you for that. My next question for all of you, the subtitle of this panel, Getting Real about Burnout, Secondary Trauma and Wellness, that could be interpreted as inviting a reappraisal, really, of the accepted perceptions of these items and of their remedies. In my own writings on self-care, I've drawn analogies to these stresses as similar to those that are endured by emergency room doctors. Well, in a recent New York Times article, health workers expressed some irritation at this persistent focus on strategies for their individual well-being. They said they don't want to hear any more presentations about personal resiliency. And instead, they want more resources to do their work. How about that? So in that same vein, really, there are commentators who assert that a focus on individual wellness in the world of indigent defense misses the bigger target. They say that the real problem is a criminal legal system with chronically under-resourced offices of attorneys fighting in vain against a mass incarceration regime. They would say that without systemic changes that dramatically reduce the number of people charged and boost defense resources, that public defender wellness programs are like field hospitals that are patching up foot soldiers before sending them back into battle to face certain injury. That's what they would say, whoever they might be. How does that critique land on each of you? I guess I'll start with the practitioners, but I'm also curious how it lands on you, Dr. Cheney.
I think it's true, I think. And it actually reminds me of the way that we sometimes compare public defense to impact litigation, right? You can need both. You can need both the systemic change, but you also need to do your own harm reduction for yourself, or you won't last, if that makes sense. And I do think there needs to be the attention on the systemic change, but that doesn't mean that you're also not going to be hurting in the meantime. I remember, I don't know if this might be a bad story to share. Early on in my practice, in my office, it was during COVID, and people were largely remote, except unless you had to be in court or in jail. And there was this, and everybody was so stressed. I mean, as we all were at the time and always. And they had this office-wide meeting with some specialist in self-care and stress and secondary trauma. And I remember, a la my personal philosophy of taking time for yourself when you can, I had the audio on in the background and was taking a bubble bath while it was because it was this virtual thing. And I remember hearing all these people from my office talking about how stressed they were and how it was affecting their home lives negatively and all these negative effects. And this woman is being oh, try this, oh, try this, oh, try this. And then at the end she goes, well, it's also true that you might just need to quit if it's so bad. And it sounds like your line of work is really hard. And I was like, that is not that helpful. I mean, maybe it is if you're looking to quit. But I do think that you need both. And I think that one thing for those current students who are in the audience, if I may, one thing that can help with that balance is you personally are probably not going to be changing the resourcing and structure of the entire system that you're operating in, which is why I think it can be important if this kind of longevity of work is important to you, to think critically about the office that you join. I remember when I was deciding where to be a public defender, I was thinking about going to Seattle, which is a relatively well-resourced office where people stay for a long time. And I was kind of oh, is it bad? Am I not as tough or not as much of a foot soldier for the cause if I'm not going to New Orleans or Philadelphia or some place where it's notoriously really, really under-resourced and you're really overworked as a public defender? But I think at the end of the day, that's why the average tenure of a public defender attorney is 2 years in this country, because most places will burn you out. And I think if you want to do it in the long term, you also need to try and find a place where there will be more kind of supports for you. So I know in my office, one thing that somebody brought up earlier at lunch is in Seattle we're unionized, which is very helpful for this type of thing because it means that there is an organization that's job, you can outsource it, right? You don't have to be pestering your bosses all the time to change this structure because there's an actual organization that's advocating for, more public defense attorneys, higher pay, more social workers for your office, things like that. And I know that that's a movement that's happening in many public defenders' offices across the country. And there are other things as well that might be true. And I would encourage everybody to think about that. And I don't think that it's a bad thing to go to a well-resourced office because you can do the work for longer, perhaps, if you want to.
Nina? Yeah. Nina, is it a bad thing to go to a well-resourced office?
I've had experiences with both. I think on both ends of the spectrum, and I think no. If you have to evaluate what your circumstances are and what resources you have and what your intentions are. If what you want is a crazy trial lawyering experience for a couple of years and then you want to move on to something else, maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing to go to the most under-resourced office and know that you're probably going to experience burnout, but that's fine. You got that experience out of it and now you can go somewhere else. I mean, it also depends on like the salaries offered at different public defenders' offices are vastly different. And so are you in a situation where you have the resources to be able to live comfortably in some of these places where the salary is paltry? And how is that going to interact with your own personal self-care practices? I mean, I think what Claire said about being selective about what office you go to is really key in this question of where and when and how do we focus on self-care. I think a lot of it comes in that initial step. And then when you're choosing the office, I think a big consideration, at least for me, would be, do you feel like they're making efforts towards the systemic change? Because that definitely the system is messed up, and whatever little things that we can do as public defenders, it's not going to change everything. But I think what's huge is if you feel like the organization that you're a part of is actually trying to change it, and that there are things you can do within that organization that will make you feel like there's movement on that front. So again, I thought the two panels earlier were really inspiring in that regard, and to try to look for organizations that have supervisors or people who are doing things like that you can access on a daily or weekly basis or whenever you need to. I think that would go such a long way. In a way, it's self-care, but it's not necessarily the mindfulness or the exercise individual focus. It's how are you going to feel being a part of this organization so that you can potentially avoid that burnout symptom of, nothing that I do matters. So finding people and an organization that makes you feel like what you do does matter, I think is a big part of how to address both, hopefully.
Thank you. So Dr. Cheney, your insights on this critique about systemic approaches to the issues that public defenders encounter as opposed to a focus on self-care.
Yeah, from what I understand, there are so many challenges within the system. And, a friend who was a former public defender was actually visiting me this week and told me that a study just came out, I think from the ABA, that said in order for public defenders to be adequately supported and to have manageable caseloads, they would need to hire 3 times as many public defenders, which is jarring and astounding. So yes, there are definitely a lot of systemic issues from what I understand. And also, I don't think that negates individual wellness. I think it's both. I think, as you said, Claire, and systems are made of individuals, and I think that the better that you take care of yourself, the more prepared you're going to be to actually fight within a system and do good, and to understand yourself, as best as you can in order to really support yourself so that you can do the work. And then this also might be a hot take, but I think that law schools could help prepare students to maintain their emotional health as lawyers. Like if there were workshops on that, or a class maybe on how do I do this type of emotionally challenging work and sustain myself so that you can last in the work. Because if the average amount of time that someone stays a public defender is 2 years, I think that signals that there's a huge problem.
Well, that last one is a great plug for anybody who's wondering, which clinic should I take? So the next question is a generational question, and this is for Claire and Vina. I entered the practice decades ago, and the nature of public defense work has evolved substantially over these decades. I'm wondering, as relative newcomers, but who encounter people like me, how you would describe the differences between the PD world of senior managers from back in the day versus what you're actually encountering as, I think, Claire, you described it as like being a foot soldier in the office. How do you think those differences impact the self-care challenges for younger lawyers as opposed to what perspectives their managers might have?
So one thing that I think is significant both for the workloads and how it affects us emotionally is that digital evidence is a much bigger part of cases now than it perhaps once was. So, for instance, in Seattle, it's a good thing that they have it, in my opinion, but there's a law that all Seattle police officers have to wear body cam, which means that when you get a new case, you get like 20 hours, not always 20, but sometimes more, sometimes less, of video that you have to watch as part of your job, and you have, like 8 hours of if you broke down your caseload to spend on that entire case, you can't even watch the body cam. But also, things are captured there that are, normally maybe you just used to hear about, and now you see it. And, I know for me personally, actually, one of the things that I find affects me the most emotionally of all the kinds of digital evidence that we have is actually watching some of the casual ways that members of our community, our clients, and also just random people who are walking by in the streets are treated with disrespect often when they're having encounters with police, and the kind of, not even the kind of core of whatever the video is watching, but just kind of the casual happenstances. The fact that it's so common and so casual, I find very, can be sometimes difficult, adds up more than you think. But also, I know that we just had a case in my office. It wasn't mine, but it was a friend of mine's, where we were representing somebody who was on trial for murder, and the killing was on video with sound because the person had security cameras in their house. And so, my colleagues have to watch it themselves. They then have to prepare their client to see it. They have to figure out how to grapple with that with a jury, how to meet all of these different people where they're going to be out emotional while also tending to their own, experience with that. And I think that's challenging. I don't really know what the answer is, but those types of things come up now, I think probably maybe more than they once did. And I just think that adds a whole dimension that we're still, as a system, figuring out how to grapple with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Claire said. There's a lot more in our universe, I think, now that we're expected to work with and know even at pretty early stages of a criminal case than I think people who started 30 years ago necessarily had. What I often hear from, the more senior attorneys who have been around for a while, they'll say, we used to just get a police report when we walked into court, and then we'd put on the prelim or just like do the trial the next day, and it was kind of like this Wild West, like anything goes. I can get my client off on just how great of a lawyer I am because I'm such a great lawyer. And I think now there's so much more focus on the holistic aspect and client-centered, like, so even the time that I think it takes to build even any level of trust with a client before doing something in court with them, I don't think that those are considerations that I feel like some of the senior attorneys really take into account, or they view that as not a necessary part of the work. So I think with just the different approach that I'm seeing in our generation, and how we learn to do things in clinic really differs in a lot of ways from how I feel like someone who's been at it for 30 years really talks about it. With technology, I'd say the other piece is we are really connected with our clients and with the work a lot more than probably was possible 20, 30 years ago, where even if you try to go on vacation, you feel sort of indebted to your clients in this way that it's really hard not to check your email and check your voicemail and see if somebody's is having a cry for help and you're the only person that they've decided to contact. That's happened to me before, where I'm in some other state at a wedding and a client has my cell phone number and calls in a mental health crisis, and it's you want to be there for that. I gave them my number for that reason, because I knew it was possible that that could happen. But I don't think that would have happened 20 or 30 years ago, because we didn't all have cell phones and our clients could use that to contact us, right? And then I think the last thought that I had about the generational differences in the offices, both offices that I've worked in, the senior leadership, especially when I started, was pretty much all white and mostly male. And so I'd say that that's another difference that I feel like generationally there's not much. As far as supervision and mentorship, I don't feel like I received much acknowledgement of how my experience might be different as a person of color, as a woman of color, and that I hope is being acknowledged more. I do think that there are steps being taken to put other people of color into leadership positions, and hopefully that will make it more tenable for younger attorneys to feel like they have people to speak with, particular issues that come up for them.
May I add? I think that's so true, and there is like the connectivity and the digital evidence. It's like this whole new level of emotional caretaking of your clients, many of whom also, maybe you're having to sit with them while they're walking you through audio or video of like them being attacked or assaulted or something, and having to sit with them through that, even if you have a different legal issue that you need to talk with them about. I think, at least in my experience, and I don't think this is, I think that this burden of the additional kind of emotional caretaking, to Vina's point, probably tends to manifest a little bit more for female public defenders, because I think many clients, just in terms of the implicit expectations that we build into our society about like who is going to listen and care for you emotionally, I think maybe that weight tends to fall a little more heavily. And I don't know what the answer is, but that is something that I notice with especially the older generation of male attorneys in our office, is sometimes they like don't seem to understand that I don't feel like I could just go into the jail and talk to one of my clients about our trial strategy and then just leave, and that's that, and that's, and yeah, hopefully that those things are changing, but I do think that it means it's even more important, if you're thinking of going into public defense, to do the kind of upfront thinking about your own boundaries and kind of how you might address those situations. Or, I don't know how you address that situation when you get that call at the wedding, but, because they probably might come up.
So, Dr. Cheney, I'm wondering whether listening to these responses, both of these advocates, whether that triggers any insights on your part.
Yeah, it just has me thinking about all the things in our jobs that aren't listed on the job description but are implicitly there, and just being an empathetic human. Like, of course, if someone reaches out to you in a mental health crisis, you want to be able to support them. I don't know that I have the answers, and I'll be honest, I have checked my email during a vacation when I wasn't supposed to, but I do know that boundaries, and I think asking for help, and maybe this is more of a question to the audience of like, as a lawyer, do you feel like is it okay to ask for help like in that situation? Because it sounds like there needs to be more resources, and if you say like, hey, my client called me at a wedding and it seemed like there was no one else for them to talk to, and you bring that up to your supervisor, number one, do you feel like you could ask that? And two, would there be support, or are we saying that like there aren't enough resources? Because I feel like, you shouldn't be in the position to where, you would need to answer. And I get that's the reality.
The response would just be, you shouldn't give your cell phone number to a client if you don't want them calling you, right? I don't think there's any, unless you have contacts outside of the organization that you could refer them to. I never felt like there was anything within the organization that could support those additional needs of the client. And so it's really, I think some people find it easier to set those boundaries very clearly, and
it's hard.
Others view it as like a part of your job to have your client to build trust with your client and build a relationship that will ultimately lead to a better outcome, in my opinion. But it becomes really tricky to navigate how much of yourself you can give, right?
I think maybe it's checking in with myself of, do I have capacity right now to answer this phone call? And if the answer is no, I think being self-compassionate and saying, like, that is okay. I can't help everyone and do every single thing, you know? Easier said than done.
Well, that's a good segue to opening up this conversation to all of you. Perhaps there's something that a panelist said that resonated with you or led to an insight or a question. So we're going to open it up now. Dr. Cheney asked specifically, for example, whether or not anyone in the audience had any ideas or insights around this dilemma that Veena describes of making yourself available, and then because you made yourself available, now you've got a problem because you have to make a decision. Somebody just reached out to you and it's at a key moment in your life, but it's different from when you had expected it to be. You don't have to answer that, but you can ask whatever you'd like, and now is a good time. And I want to again thank Daniela Guillen, who is a member of the Criminal Defense Clinic team and has been kindly serving on microphone duty as well. Thank you, Daniela. So any questions or insights are welcome. Yeah.
Thanks. So I did.
Go ahead and say who you are. By the way.
I'm Nick Eckenweiler, class of 2020. I did eviction defense for a year and a half after law school, and one of the sources of emotional difficulty that I did not feel prepared for was clients who, because of the difficult situation, attacked me in certain ways. Not to say that like this was a major feature of my work or that it affected me particularly badly. I think some of my colleagues who were not white men or who presented as queer had it much worse with some of their clients. And this was particularly difficult, I think, for reasons that everybody can understand. We go into the work to represent the clients who are at the mercy of this, of a lot of structural injustices, and we're there to try to represent them, to get them some measure of justice, to shield them to the extent that we can, to tell their stories, and to have them to have to deal with their anger, their frustration, expressed in ways that attack our emotional integrity is something that's very difficult. I was wondering if either of you could speak to that, how you've managed it. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a great question. Any answers? Anyone would like to respond?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for bringing that up. I do think that it's a big part of the job, and it doesn't really get discussed, and you might not really experience it in clinic or in your internships. You might be a little bit shielded from that, but you're going to be in a situation where your clients are rightfully really upset about how they've been treated, and you're the first person or the only person who will listen to them about it. And they might also have a perception of you being a part of the system that is oppressing them, and you are. So even recognizing that doesn't make it easier to deal with somebody cussing you out or yelling at you or belittling you or equating you with basically being a DA or whatever. There are lots of ways that clients who have been traumatized themselves can repeat those words and those behaviors onto you. And I don't think that is adequately discussed in either office that I've worked in, but I will say that the one way that I found to deal with it is just to kind of like swap stories and share those things with other people, and then you kind of like, well, this is just part of the job. You almost start to joke about it, which is not maybe the most healthy response, but at least you realize that it's really not about you, right? This is a kind of a universal experience that everybody is having. And if you are feeling, and maybe Dr. Cheney would have more useful language or tips for this, but if you're feeling triggered by this, to step away from it and remind yourself that it's really not about you, and can you recenter yourself and still be able to provide the service that you have signed up to provide for this person, regardless of whether they are showing appreciation or not. Just a random side note, there's a huge difference in this between like working in Oakland or Alameda County and working in the Northern Mariana Islands, which was really refreshing. I completely understand why systemically, I think the clients that I had in Alameda County have so many more reasons to be upset and to be suspicious of public defenders or anybody in the kind of criminal legal system. In the Northern Mariana Islands, the sort of racial dynamics and the dynamics with the police are really, really different and generally quite friendly. And so there was a lot more just, thank you for helping me. I'm so happy that you're here to help me. Like a lot more deferential and respectful, which was, I will say, it made the job a lot easier to do. But that doesn't mean that can be transferred, over to most contexts in the mainland United States.
Yeah, that's such an under talked about part of the job. I think though, like Vina was saying, it's really not about you. And the interesting thing, at least in my experience, is I think most of the people that are angry with you actually also know that it's not about you. And I've actually had several encounters with clients who they are like yelling at me and they will say something to the effect of, I'm so angry and I know that this isn't your fault, but I'm just so mad and like you're here and you're the person from the system that's standing in front of me. Like people, I couldn't even count how many people have said that to me. And I think that because of that, like we were talking, meeting people with compassion, it's hard, but what most people just want, the system just like flattens people. It doesn't allow them to be seen or heard. I mean, the court system, I remember something Professor Tyler said when we were in clinic that I still think about all the time, which is if you were like an alien and you were dropped into the United States court system, who would you think the hearing was about based on what happens in court? Because you would never think it would be about our clients the way that everybody's processing and nobody's allowed to talk. And I think that's why so much of what we can offer people in a system that's viewed against them is our compassion and listening to them and trying to understand where they come from. And so I think in those situations, at least when I've been in them, sometimes this doesn't like always work, but most of the time, I think if you don't get escalated in a response and you're like, I'm here for you and I hear what you're saying and I want to help you and I want to hear what happened to you, and usually people will call, like it gets out of their system and then you can have a substantive conversation. And in many ways, I actually think those can be some of like the better, more trusting relationships because, also because somebody can see that you are going to stay there. And I also think to that, and that kind of trust building can take a little more work at the beginning. And often those kinds of, in my experience, interactions happen at the beginning of a client relationship. But to the extent that sometimes things come up later, it can take a little more work at the beginning to invest in that kind of trust building, but I think it pays off dividends in like many different ways if you do. So, I have a colleague who I learned from him to do this, which is to go into the jails and visit every client that you have that's in custody every week, which may not sound like that much to you guys, but I know in our office the standard is that you have to visit people at least once a month, and often you'll have these longer cases where there aren't updates that come that frequently. But to just go in and be like, hey, what's up? We don't have any updates. I wanted to check in. And it can take more time to do that each week, but it matters so much when you're in a position where somebody's hitting a roadblock and they're getting upset, or you're giving them bad news, or you're like in trial and you can't go that week. They trust that you would if you could. And I think that trying to remember that it's not about you and still be there actually really, really helps.
Thank you, Dr. Cheney.
Yeah, as it's been said, I would say not personalizing, and like it's been said, knowing that it's not about you. And often, and I think this could be applied to more than just a client that's upset, but with people that can be challenging, you know, of looking at what is the subtext of their behavior, and often it's that they're really hurting. And so I think with people being able to validate them and say, hey, I hear you. I hear that you're upset. I hear that you're angry. I hear that you're hurting. Tell me more. Like, I feel like that's something we don't say enough to people. Like, I want to hear your story. I care about you. I would be upset too. And I think for you, just cognitively thinking about what are the sets of circumstances that this person has lived through in order to be reacting like this, because it's probably been a lot. And then I think also on everyone's end, you know, seeking support, whether that's through friends and being able to laugh about it, or not laugh at them, but, you know, at the situation, or through speaking to your manager, or talking to a therapist, you know, or journaling, whatever it is, but making sure that you also have support.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi there, Cooper D'Agostino, from the same clinic here as Nick. I was curious about some of the strategies that are employed to distinguish between stressors that are brought on by one's own activities, one's own experiences, one's own errors in the process of learning how to address different types of cases, versus stressors that come from lack of resourcing or externally. And what are the strategies that you use to distinguish between, all right, this is something I need to learn and grow and keep a growth mindset, versus this is a factor that's outside of my control? Like, are those sort of cognitive strategies? Are there different meditation strategies used for that? And resources in the workplace and among peer groups that are useful for that?
Thank you for that question. I think we'll ask Dr. Cheney to respond.
Wait, can you say the question one more time? Sorry.
What?
Or the essence of the question.
Yes.
What are sort of the preferred strategies and resources for addressing sort of internally focused stress that comes from our own, the work we individually do, and that's like, this is your brief, this is your oral argument, versus a stressor that comes externally. You don't have time to do X, Y, Z, or this new development occurred and there's no way you could have controlled for it.
Okay, so the things we can control versus the things that we can't control, that is a tough one. I'm still figuring it out. But I think one thing with the things that we can't control is learning to forgive ourselves and knowing that we're not going to be perfect, and letting go of perfectionism. There is no way that we can do every single thing for ourselves and for everybody. And I think it's letting it go and knowing, like, okay, like, I'm still good, like I'm still doing my job and I'm doing the best that I can. And sometimes I tell my clients, you know, if you have 30% to give and you give 30%, you're actually giving 100%. And that is okay at times. And then in terms of, I think the other question was the things we can control and the things that we can influence, doing our best, you know, like that's all that we can do.